Good evening, and thank you so much for being here. This is the fourth in an 8-part series of community discussions of racial justice and law enforcement, organized by the College Community Partnership, Racial Justice, and presented online by the Levitt Center for Public Affairs at Hamilton College. We are also broadcasting live on WPNY. Our partnership includes 6 colleges in the Oneida and Herkimer counties, as well as the Community Foundation, Save Our Streets, the United Way, the Frontiers Club, and the Latino Association. Our goal is to develop a dialogue on racial equity and criminal justice, and to also support law enforcement reform efforts by local governments. My name is Gbemende Johnson from Hamilton College, and I will serve as moderator for tonight's discussion, which will focus on understanding the use of force. We will begin with a presentation from our 3 panelists, and that will take us to about 7:30. If you'd like to join us online to participate in the discussion, please go to community4justice.org. That's community4justice.org. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen to submit your question, and closed captioning will be available. After the presentations, I'll pose your questions to the panel, and the broadcast on WPNY will end at 8 p.m., but the webinar will continue for another half hour. And similar to last week at 7:55, we will turn to Dr. Michael Woods, who is a composer, performer, and professor of music at Hamilton College. Importantly, meaningful change and reform can only happen with input from all segments of the community. So thank you very much for joining us. And as a reminder, one way to have your voice heard is to take our survey on racial equity and criminal justice by texting MV Justice to 898-211. That's MV Justice to 898-211. So as I noted earlier, the topic of our discussion will be understanding the use of force, and I will introduce our 3 presenters who will each speak for about 10 minutes. We have with us Professor Bernard Hyman, who is a professor of practice at Utica College. Professor Hyman was also previously Bureau Chief of the Oneida County District Attorney's Economic Crime Bureau. We also have with us Professor Mark Polkosnik, Associate Professor of Law at Herkimer College. Professor Polkosnik, his previous experience includes being Certified Master Instructor Trainer for Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council. And finally, we have with us Attorney Stephen L. Lockwood. Lockwood has practiced law for over 40 years and has particular experience in cases involving civil rights matters, including police misconduct and discrimination involving municipalities and police. So we'll start with Mark, then go to Stephen, and then end the presentation with remarks from Bernard, and then open to questions. So Mark, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for having me and giving me this opportunity to participate in this initiative. My perspective is to discuss use of force from the police perspective, in the sense of how they're taught about use of force and how that has evolved a bit over the last probably 30, 40 years. The use of force can be anything from how an officer conducts themselves to actually the first step is their physical presence. So let me run through a continuum briefly, then we can flesh that out a little bit. The general continuum is the first step would be an officer's physical presence only. That's why departments stress having a professional uniform. There's controversy, many departments require a hat. They want the officer to have a professional and commanding appearance, and they want their demeanor to be neutral at that point. They want them to appear that they're there to be, and they are to be helpful and to listen. So again, it's physical presence, and you hope that that resolves everything. And to be very honest, I came up on the police officer side, and it does resolve many things, most things. The physical presence of the officer is extremely important. Then the next step up from that would be verbal direction. The officers may very well give someone verbal direction. It could be something as simple as, may I please see your driver's license? Keep your hands where I can see them. Put your hands on the steering wheel. Notice there's a difference in that between a request and a command. Put your hands on the steering wheel. Keep your hands where I can see them. And may I please see your driver's license? The verbiage used is very important, as well as the way in which it's delivered. And that is perceived by the person as a step up in force from physical presence. So you have the physical presence combined with the verbal, and hopefully that will manage the situation. Officers are taught whenever possible, and they get a lot of training in conflict de-escalation. They need more, but they're getting a good bit of it. In conflict de-escalation, and situation analysis and diffusion, verbal judo, things like that, to use the verbal levels to keep conflict down at a minimum. To take a step up from that, assuming that doesn't work, the next step up would be using these, what we call soft, empty-handed methods. And that might be something, that's putting your hands on someone, but not in a permanently harmful way. It might be a come-along hold, might be a wrist lock to stop them from, swinging at you. Could be any of that. And we call that soft because you're not trying to inflict pain, you're just trying to inflict compliance. And it is pain compliance. People, if they struggle against it, it will usually hurt. If they don't struggle, the idea is it shouldn't hurt. But it's to get compliance, again, at a lower level. Stepped up from that are hard compliance, and this is hard empty-handed. That's punching and kicking. That's very much a step up from the soft-handed, but it is occasionally necessary. Step up from that are intermediate weapons. Call it what you want, but you've got impact weapons, which would be a baton. You have electrical weapons, which would be tasers, stun guns, that sort of thing. And then you have chemical weapons, pepper spray, and then in crowd situations, tear gas, that's what I'm trying to say. So you have those. And those are what we would consider to be non-lethal weapons, although improperly used, they can be lethal. We also have something available now that they're using more and more called, for less than lethal weapons, they're using something called beanbag rounds. It can be fired out of a shotgun. And what they do is it hits the person with either a wooden block or a beanbag. It hurts, but it's not lethal. It's to stop someone's attack. And they have used that successfully in quite a few instances from what the literature suggests. Then the big step. The big step is next is deadly force. And this is using something that will or is likely to cause death or grievous bodily harm, firearm. Hitting somebody in the head with a baton, hitting somebody in the head with a flashlight could be deadly force. So there are many different styles of this. And again, it should only be used when the officer or someone else, their life is in imminent danger. A capacity, opportunity, and jeopardy are the three elements that the officers are taught. So that is basically the continuum. Please know though, you don't have to go through every step. If you're an officer on the street, somebody pulls a gun on you, you don't have to stand there and give them verbal commands, although you would at the same time, probably. But you don't have to go through the hard and the, the easy and all that. You can go straight to deadly force if that's what's called for. But the theory is that you should always, always defuse situations using the lowest level of force possible for the situation. And officers are taught this. They do scenario after scenario with this. The training that we gave them, they would go through firing scenarios, shoot, don't shoot, and they were graded on this. And the idea was to try to develop their judgment in the use of force. And use of force has become, with body cameras now, more monitorable than it was. It used to be that the use of force was pretty much if somebody received a serious injury, but on the lower end, nobody ever found out about it. Well, fortunately, that's not true anymore. And one of the things that I told every single officer that I ever trained with this is, God forbid, you may have to take a person's life, but you never have to call him a very bad name. You don't have to impugn his race or his mother. You don't have to do that. You may choose to do that, and you're wrong, but you don't have to do that. So how does this work? Okay, you've seen the continuum. This is nice in theory, but officers are trained to do this on traffic stops. They're trained to do this on domestic situations. They're trained to do this in all kinds. And departments taking the step up now, the supervision level. Use of force is now well documented, or supposed to be. Policy-wise, most departments have a policy where use of force is very well documented, and where the officer that employs it has to explain why, what force was used, what aid was given the person against it was used, and what's the outcome. And those are reviewed by the supervisors and by internal affairs and management. And the idea is to make sure that nobody is using force frivolously. And you may have somebody that has a bad run where they get themselves in situations or get involved in calls where they have to use some physical force. And it may be they have 3 or 4 in a short period of time. And that in and of itself would not be overly condemning. They would just look at it carefully and make sure. So this is used for the officer on the street, supervisory level, and policy level at the very top. Also, serving warrants and making arrests. The uses of force in that involved. I've seen it as easily from somebody doing exactly what they're told verbally. And by the way, that's how most go. People do what they're told verbally, and they go along with the plan. Officers, again, every police department in this nation, I would bet, has a policy manual. And the policy manual discusses the use of force and the department's policies using force. I have not read the one from Minneapolis, but I would like to see their directives manual, because I know that officer, I believe his name is Chauvin, that's charged with the murder case there for kneeling on the gentleman's neck. I believe his defense is that is specifically permitted in their manual. I'd like to see that with my own eyes, but they often do list exactly what you're entitled to do and what you're forbidden to do. For instance, hitting someone in the head with a flashlight in our agency was absolutely forbidden unless you're in a deadly force situation. If you would be equally justified in using a firearm, but the weapon you have in your hand is a flashlight, then so be it. But that is not a gratuitous thing to do. And from what I've observed over the last about 30 years, it's gotten a lot better. And we've got a long way to go, a long way. But the training, the body cameras, and the supervision of this, I think is going to be an education of the officers and supervisors of this, from old school styles to more of the modern way where the accountability is stressed. 40 years ago, police officers were sometimes taught it's not really what happens, it's what you write in a report. But now they're able to have backup information and with the video and the observations. That's about it for me. I hope that gives you just a very brief summary of use of force from the police end, how they're trained with it, and the rough outlines of what they're taught.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. Next, we will turn to Attorney Stephen Lockwood.
Hello, everyone. And I first want to express my gratitude to Professor Frank Anacarico for imagining this remarkable initiative to address the long-standing problem of racial and institutional injustice in both law enforcement and the criminal justice system. And to you students, this is not a new journey. This is not a new battle. This has been going on for centuries, but particularly in, I'd like to note that in May of 1987, in the report to the governor from the New York State Commission on Criminal Justice and the Use of Force, all these issues that we're now addressing were addressed. I think the problem is really what Professor Anacarico and I wrote an article in the Buffalo Law Review, and it basically said it was I believe it was entitled "The Responsibility of the Police Command for its line officers, for its patrol officers," and it's really the responsibility of the police command to properly recruit officers, to properly train them, and to then to supervise them. And if they run afoul of what the recommended practices and procedures are, to discipline them and perhaps retrain them. So, but for my contribution to this particular seminar, I've been a civil rights attorney since 1972, and a good part of my litigation practice has been suing the police, not only here, but I've sued the Kingston police, I've sued the Town of Cicero Police, and I want to select a case, Bersani versus the Town of Cicero, which I think covers all the use of force issues. And briefly, Mr. Bersani, Louis Bersani, ran a boat works on Oneida Lake. And he had a son, John, who was 14 years old at the time. And he worked at the Lakeshore Country Club on Oneida Lake, where his mother was the assistant manager. And he used to go back, he was a dishwasher. And he used to go back and forth to work on his ATV. And he really only crossed 2 roads, otherwise he used the fields. So this one particular day, which was June 22, 1981, he was crossing over Lakeshore Country Club, and Officer Wynn, a part-time police officer of the Town of Cicero, stopped him, made him get in his car, and basically impounded the ATV. So when Mr. Bersani finally got a hold of Officer Wynn, he demanded that he come to his, because he had first sent his son Jim, who was, I believe, was 18 or 19 years old at the time, to get the ATV back with a $50 bill. And they refused, and they said they'd have to bring the registration. ATVs weren't registered in those days. In any event, reluctantly, Officer Wynn showed up with Officer Hall, both part-time Cicero police officers. And when they pulled up to his boat works, Louis Bersani saw them coming and he walked out. The complaint they actually were responding to were illegally parked cars at this park where there were women and teenagers who had illegally parked cars, but they were swimming and there was a little beach there. So when they both got out of their cars, put on their hats, hiked up their trousers, and approached with full equipment. And Louis Bersani greeted them by saying, "Which one of you assholes likes to pick on women and kids?" Officer Hall and Wynn then just took him down. One pulled his hair and swept his feet out from under him, so he fell on his right elbow and his right shoulder. He dislocated his shoulder at the time, and he was in real pain, experiencing real pain. They then proceeded to brutalize him by putting him up against the car, handcuffing him, and then putting him in the back of the car and slamming the door on his legs. All of this was witnessed by many witnesses, and many of them testified at the trial. To shorten it up a little bit, I was the 5th attorney, I believe, and it was 5 years before it went to trial in Onondaga Supreme Court. And we had a jury of 5 women and 1 Irishman. And so we had a lot of witnesses, and we tried the case. And when the jury came back with a verdict, there were 4 causes of action, 2 for the son, James Bersani, and 2 for Louis Bersani. They brought back a verdict of $450,000. Now, the judge, who's deceased now, is Leo Hayes, and he was a former district attorney. And for you students, you should know that many of our courts have judges who were former prosecutors, both the state and federal level. And so, in my opinion, many of them are biased in favor of the police. In any event, they appealed, but before they tried to have the verdict set aside because they basically claimed that it was first that they were prejudiced by my reference to Rodney King case, which had happened in March of 1981. And for you students who aren't familiar with that, Rodney King was a black man. He was arrested for driving while intoxicated. He tried to escape. several police officers, took him to the ground. And I remember it was Chief Darrell Gates, chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, said they had hit him with nightsticks something like 55 times and recommended that they be discharged. When it finally, when the trial finally came, the jury did not convict any of the police officers. Later, a federal investigation convicted, I think, one of the four. In any event, when they were acquitted, there was 6 days of rioting and 60-some deaths in LA. And you know, there was all the rioting and that goes on. And they had to call in, as I remember, both the state, not only the Los Angeles Police Department, but the other police forces to quell the riots. This is nothing new. What's going on with the George Floyd case. Okay, so this has been going on for years. And I can also say that when they appealed the Bersani case, they tried to say it was, you know, excessive, and they actually appealed, and the appellate division in Rochester actually did reduce the verdict by to, I think, $265,000 or $275,000. Okay. But anyway, that's just an example. And I also have to tell you that of all the cases I've had and successfully tried, the only ones I remember that were just absolutely foolproof excessive force cases were for Black people, and we got no cause of action, which means you spend all this time and you lose and you get nothing. And the client gets nothing for all the pain and suffering they've gone through. So anyway, I just thought you'd enjoy that from the courtroom, and I'll leave it there for the time being.
Thank you so much, Steve. And we will hear from Bernie. Oh, Bernie, you muted?
You're muted, Bernie.
Thank you. I should know better by now. Again, thank you for having me as part of this discussion. I've been looking forward to this one in particular because we've seen a spark in this discussion, and the two panelists before me have actually touched on the areas that I'm looking to touch on, especially since the death of George Floyd. You know, the death of George Floyd has inspired a lot of discussion. And it inspired what we are talking about here today. It inspired the webinars that we're going through. And frankly, it's sad to me that we would look at a moment like that as a moment of inspiration. However, we are here, and it's a moment for us to do something and make something out of the tragedy. And the tragic death of George Floyd, to me, is a turning moment, because America got to see an ugly side of law enforcement. And I resist using the word law enforcement there, because I really want to say that, you know, Chauvin is the epitome of what law enforcement shouldn't be. So to call him law enforcement, to me, is sort of an oxymoron. It just doesn't work. However, he was the officer on the scene. He was the officer in charge that day. And because of the decisions he made, a man is now dead who should not be dead. And that is the sad part. That is the tragedy that we need to talk about. And it's interesting because as we continue these discussions, and Attorney Lockwood pointed out how some of the verdicts in courtrooms don't come out the way we would think they should come out. But we also know that, based on what my colleague Mark said, that
Chauvin is going to mount the defense, and that defense may be one of, that was a policy that we had that we could use that maneuver. And interestingly enough, from where I sit, that doesn't matter if it was, because the ultimate decision, the ultimate lack of judgment that was exercised in that case, to me, negates any excuse that he could come up with. And we can explore this from a multitude of areas. So one, the idea of using force or using deadly physical force is when one is in a threat of imminent force against himself. And we would expect that a police officer or any human being faced with that level of force where they're in danger for their life, that they would be able to meet it with deadly physical force. That's what the justification laws of the United States and every state within it say. That's not what we had with Derek Chauvin and his encounter with George Floyd. What we had was the call for a use of lesser force. Simply put, what was required at that moment was to restrict Mr. Floyd from leaving or to apprehend him. Once apprehended, the use of force, the need for use of force ends. There was never a need in that situation for deadly physical force, and yet that's what we had. And so if an officer decides to use that as a defense in that case, it defies logic. But even worse than that, for myself, watching the video for the first time, the thing that struck me was, even if in that situation, that hold, obviously, that maneuver was just, it was so inappropriate for what the situation was to begin with. Because anybody who could use any judgment whatsoever in watching that situation, frankly, I looked at it as, this is a medical situation that's happening here. And they took a medical situation, denied medical care to the person, and then used force against the person such that it exacerbated the medical situation and killed the person unnecessarily. So there is no justification. There is no real application of the use of force doctrine when it comes to police officers. So it's interesting that there is going to be a trial, and ultimately all of these issues will play out at trial. But the interesting thing about the death of George Floyd, or not the interesting part about the death, but the interesting part about our discussions that have followed his death, are lots of questions with regard to why are the rules with regard to use of force different for police officers than they are for civilians? And there is an answer to that. And there's an answer to some of the pieces that come with this. But the answer ultimately is yes. In New York State, for instance, let's take New York. If I'm faced in my own home with an intruder and I have an escape route, I have an obligation to take that escape route. With regard to police officers, they don't have that same obligation. In fact, their obligation is to make sure that they stay around and take care of the threat. In fact, if they don't, that is a cause for disciplinary action as well. So there is a reason that the justification levels for police officers and civilians are a little bit different, because we expect them to go toward the danger. It's the same thing for first responders. We expect them to go toward the danger. However, with that comes a huge level of responsibility. And that responsibility is the ability to exercise judgment in the face of the most complicated circumstances, such that you prevent yourself from acting inappropriate and using your force in such a way that you kill a man when he should be alive today. So as we go forward, the discussions that we have to start having go to issues that my colleague Mark brought up a little while ago. If in fact we look at the Minnesota policy, we look at their policy and we review it, and we see within that policy that they okayed such a hold, shouldn't we as citizens be able to review the policies of our police departments that serve us and review them and have input on what those policies should be. Because frankly, if you ask me, most of the discussions I've had over the last few years go exactly to that. Well, what is policy and why is it the policy? And shouldn't those policies then be public and people be allowed to comment on them? After all, we do that with things like regulations passed by the Environmental Protection Agency or OSHA or whatever it may be. Why shouldn't we do the same thing, reviewing those policies by the community to say, yeah, we understand why that policy is in place. We sign on to that use, to having that policy be exercised within our jurisdiction. So this is where our discussions need to go as far as framing how we can change law enforcement moving forward and change the criminal justice system overall moving forward, is to really have a discussion about what we expect. Because the fact of the matter is the policies that they use, where do they come from and who gets to decide whether or not those policies are right? And to me, it's the citizenry that has every right to have a say in those. After all, this is law enforcement is sworn to protect and serve the community. And why shouldn't the community have a say in how they are policed and how they are treated upon any encounter that they have with law enforcement? So, with that, I'll just grab a couple other things real quick because I know my time is running short. But, questions, all the questions that have come up that have been sparked by this conversation are questions surrounding, can we envision ever seeing the police without weapons? Can we envision having a community devoid of the police? If we defund the police, or in fact, there are groups out there that believe that we should abolish law enforcement and the police altogether. While those are all, frankly, great parts of the conversation to have, I don't know if we're prepared to go that far in our decision-making at this point, when we can actually make some real hard strides in fixing what's been broken, fixing what some of the issues are within the system. So that's one, attacking policy, because frankly, a lot of the questions I get after in the last few months have been about policy and why the policies are the way they are. And again, people should have a say in what those policies are become. So, those are the things I look forward to talking to further in this discussion. And I will turn turn it back over to you, Gbemende. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for your comments, and we have a number of questions. So this first question is about training. Locally, how much of police officers' training time is dedicated to de-escalation training? How often is it repeated? Does the quality or quantity of training have any significant impact on controlling the use of force in departments? So that's a couple of questions.
Well, I could take that one a little bit. First of all, we did ask the local police department to share their policies, and particularly on the use of force and Article 35, what the training is. They declined. But it is my understanding that all the police departments in New York State, if they want to be accredited, have to submit a plan every 5 years to be first accredited, and then every 5 years thereafter to be re-accredited. And they have to share all their proposed policies and procedures with the Division of Criminal Justice Services, and then they're accredited. But I think there's a difference in procedures and in policies and practices. You can have all the great policies you want; they can look pristine and have none of these suggestions that they can use excessive force. But it's the practices on the street, and that's why it's the responsibility of the police command to not only produce those policies, but then they've got to train on them. And a good question for me is, which we asked and we didn't get an answer, is who trains at the police academy? You know, we know that this police academy here in Mohawk Valley Community College serves 7 counties, okay? But what is actually taught and who teaches it? Because I think it makes a difference, you know? And Professor Anna Carrico and I presented years ago in the 80s to the academy, this academy locally. After we presented and talked about excessive force, which to me is whatever is unnecessary is excessive. Okay, you don't need to use force at all sometimes, but if you use more force than is necessary, then it's excessive, and that's the law. And there's all sorts of case law on it. But after we presented, and I didn't remember this, but Professor Anna Carrico did. He's younger than I am. The training officer actually then said to the police officers, well, if that happens, if you think that, you know, you're going to be sued or anything because you used too much force, then just charge resisting arrest, because that'll justify your use of force. Now that's totally antithetical to our rights as American citizens, okay? But you know, that probably happens a lot, especially if you've got veteran police officers who, you know, have used force. But what I think is revolutionary in the state of New York is when Governor Cuomo and the legislature repealed 50A of the Civil Rights Law, which protected police records, personnel records. So you didn't know if a police officer had no prior complaints, he had 40, you didn't know if they were for excessive force or discourtesy. And now we can get that. You can foil it, students, and you can get the records on everybody. And I think you should, you know. And there's even some police officers, I understand, that are going to retire early or retire, and you know, because they don't want to be exposed. Okay, and I'm not saying that there's a lot of bad police officers in any state, but particularly around this area, there's been a lot of reform over the years. But if you really want to look at this issue and bring reform, then I think you need to look at the complaints against police officers, whether it's in Wisconsin or Minnesota or New York or wherever.
Yeah, I can add to that.
Add to that. Oh, sorry, Mark, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, having been on both sides of this, in my experience, we were given retraining. The question was about retraining. We were given retraining in use of force every 3 months when we went to the range to qualify. That was always an element, was retraining in use of force, and also discussion briefly, of course, but discussion of any new cases that have come out recently in that area. Our department kept a very close tab on that. And then we would discuss that. So you were exposed to that policy, having that explained to you every 3 months at least.
And Bree, did you want to follow up?
If I could add, in part of this process that we're going through, I've been actually having some discussions with local law enforcement executives, and they talk about the training, the de-escalation training that takes place in, in the academy. But verbal judo has been something I believe that they say they train up once a year, that they reinforce that training. So I want to just point out a couple of things that we need to think about. So even though they may be some of the and when I say local law enforcement executives, I've spoken with the bigger departments. The issue we have really, and we kind of miss this every time we have these discussions, is we forget about the smaller departments, which have just as much an effect on the citizenry as the bigger departments. So those larger departments that have been accredited and have policies and try to reinforce those policies and do training and have training budgets, we tend to talk about those agencies, but the smaller agencies just don't have the budget for doing it and don't do it. So, and people are exposed to them just as much. And that's an issue that needs to be addressed in this discussion, is how we allow certain police officers to continue. Because frankly, in people who know locally, we know of police officers who have been removed from some of the larger departments simply to end up working in a smaller department. And they've been removed for excessive force or whatever it may be, or some other unethical behavior, and they still end up wearing a badge and a gun elsewhere. So that's one of the issues we need to think about. And the last thing I'll say on the de-escalation training, Mark is right. This is training that needs to continually happen because, we're all professors here in some way, shape, or form. Most of us on this panel have taught. And we know that standing in front of a class of 30 people, sometimes we're going to be lucky if 5 people out of the 30 get everything we're saying. So you can train people. It doesn't mean that it comes across or that it's absorbed in the same way or it comes out and is executed in the same way. And that's just the human condition. And so that's why it needs to be continually trained, because we're talking about human beings in these jobs making their own judgments at times.
Thank you for that, Bernie. And a quick clarification, can you translate the phrase verbal judo for the audience?
So actually, I will leave that. Can I leave that to Mark? Because Mark was.
Sure. Verbal judo are techniques that, again, are verbal and not physical, where you de-escalate conflict. For example, if somebody's yelling, it could be very simple as lowering your voice. When you lower your voice, they often will quiet down in order to hear what you're saying. So that's like one technique of verbal judo, but that's the way you do it. You use verbiage, you use your voice, you use your inflections, you use your body movements in a way to diffuse conflict.
Okay, thank you for that. So this next question, it touches on some of the things that were just said. So this is from an attendee. Why aren't police subject to random psychological assessments? If an officer has been on the job for over 10 years, the last assessment, barring the discharge of the weapon, was done during the hiring process. Individuals can change drastically in even 2 years, never mind a 10-year plus period.
I can address that a little bit. Part of what I did after leaving law enforcement was I was co-owner of a company with another former police officer, and we did psychological evaluations, both pre-employment and critical incident, meaning an officer involved in a shooting, involved in a bad physical altercation, involved in a bad car accident. And a lot of what we would do was attempt to decide, do they need a full evaluation? Do they need a verbal debriefing? And the goal is this: number one, are they ready to go back to work immediately? And usually not so much. We wanted a fixed period of time minimum. It's just a decompression period where people could have off and then have the discussion with us. But our department's policy was if they were involved in any of that or accused, credibly accused, by the way, of excessive force, they came to see one of us before they were allowed back to duty.
Thank you. Oh, Bernie, were you?
I was just going to add to that. I think that's a critical piece that we will be looking at in some of the recommendations that may come out of some of the work we're doing locally, looking at continued psychological evaluations beyond that first employment, especially when Mark mentions critical incident, but also critical lifestyle changes, incidents that happen, family changes, behavioral changes, being able to pick up on that. That goes back to Steve's point of police command being able to have someone in place or the department being ready to recognize when things are changing for an officer and recognize the need for some intervention.
And this is a follow-up to that in terms of the reassessments. In terms of resources, will that affect the ability of a department to do this in terms of the resources that they're receiving? When you mentioned the smaller departments, will it be more difficult for them to do more frequent assessments?
It absolutely carries a cost, but I think the cost of human life will outweigh whatever that cost is. And I think that the safety that we're looking for, the relationship that we're looking for between the police and the community, I'm not sure we can really put a dollar amount on that when we're talking about saving people's lives. So yes, will there be a cost associated? Absolutely, because someone has to pay for those psychological testing to be done. But is it necessary? I would think so.
Thank you. And Steve, did you have a?
I just wanted to say maybe the state could pay for it, just because the community has, you know, if we're doing this statewide reform in each community, then why not put the money behind it? I know, there's been this huge COVID downturn in the revenue that states and the United States, everybody else is receiving. But I mean, if we're doing this as a long-term reform, let the state fund it.
Thank you for that. So continuing a number of really interesting questions here from another attendee, and this is actually a question that I had as well. A common reaction to an officer yelling a command is fear and anxiety. Although the person may be willing to comply with the officer's request, the person may react in a way that appears to be non-compliant because of the fear they are experiencing. How should officers consider the emotions of the suspect when deciding use of force?
So if you don't mind, I'll jump in on that. I was just actually, I'm going to go away from a police officer actually example, because we've been talking about criminal justice as the whole piece. And recently I was reviewing an old case that actually took place some years ago now, but it was involving a judge who actually had been upset with a domestic violence victim for not showing up to her courtroom, and really berated berated her, held her in contempt, and put her in jail, and really showed no compassion for her and the victim in this case. She actually expressed how much anxiety she was going through. And any of us who dealt in domestic violence, we know that folks, going through that are facing an extraordinary amount of anxiety for a variety of issues. One of them being their own personal safety, because frankly, and my prosecutor friends and law enforcement friends can speak to this, we can't really offer them 100% security. So if I put someone in jail for a year on an assault third, 8 months later, they're out again. And we live in a small community, and unless you find a hiding place for that person that they can hide away and never see their family again, they're still at risk, and they have to weigh those things out. So that causes an extraordinary amount of anxiety, and sometimes that's why they don't show up to court. And so for this judge to have berated her and treated her like that, and also asked her, frankly, said to her, so am I to believe that none of this happened in here? And she says, no, it happened. I just didn't want to come testify because when I'm in the same place as him, it gives me extreme anxiety. So yes, we need to be more cognizant of those reactions that we get from people, anxiety and panic disorders, and understanding of those things, because they cause reactions that we may not otherwise understand or expect.
Thank you. Mark or Steve, did you want to add to that?
I think Bernie summed it up right. There is the whole system wide, and you do have to look at the whole person. You have to look at the compassion part of it. You have to look at what their experience is and what you're seeing. And you have to decide, is this reaction at me? Is this reaction somebody that's terrified and can't respond to me? Is this somebody that has been injured and can't respond to me the way I think they should? And then you have to decide. And one of the things you do, don't ever forget, don't ever take your eyes off somebody's hands. You're going to get hurt, it's going to be with their hands. So, you keep your officer's safety, you watch this stuff, you watch their hands, you watch their behavior, and then you try to verbally coax them into doing what you need done. And this is assuming it's not an immediate life-threatening thing, but you try to coax them into doing what you need done. It might be come closer to you, it might be step out where I can see you, it might be all kinds of things. And you can do that without putting your life in danger. And the person, sometimes it's a matter of simply stepping out and showing them who you are, let them see it really is the police and not they're a strange person that is trying to trick them and, beat them or whatever. In domestic situations, you see all kinds of horrible things. Well, you know, no, that could happen. And sometimes it's best just to try to tell them, look, I know you're terrified. I know this is a bad situation, but come tell me about it. And often if you'll invest a little bit of time and be a little patient, it'll happen.
By the way, that judge was removed from the bench and disciplined by the state judiciary commission that she lived in.
Thank you. So there's a question. So race has come up, but one attendee says explicitly, you know, no one has mentioned racism and bias. How do we train officers and commanders to act fairly when they live in a racist society?
Well, I think it goes beyond training the officers. We got to change society, and that's why this generation of students and the whole nation has a great opportunity because the racism is institutionalized. I happen to be married to a Black woman, and you know, I know just from her experience, you know, just how ingrained and this is a racist society. I mean, it's just ingrained in it. And Blacks have been, not only they were brought here as slaves, you know, and then the Native Americans were basically wiped out and put on reservation. The slaves were put on plantations, and we've never had an acknowledgement of the racism in this country. And most white people don't want to feel that they're, you know, have any kind of racist outlook, that, you know, they think they're not really prejudiced. But if you really look at things, there's a million examples. You know, any Black person can tell you. You know, if I could quickly, we haven't addressed whether a citizen can defend themselves, which again was in the Bersani case. And you can, under Article 35, if you're attacked unjustifiably by an officer, then you can defend yourself. You have that right.
And hopefully we can discuss that further and when the webinar continues after the broadcast.
Good.
I just wanted to add on the training, that question, the reason I hesitated in answering that question is because it brings in conditions that almost make it impossible to give an answer. So I like Steve's answer in the way he phrased it. The only thing I would say is that, is it a question of training? Because again, it goes back to my point about training. There is training and there has been training. But that doesn't mean that the training takes for everyone. And so, you know, just as an example, we even talked about mental health, and this is not real, the example I'm going to give is not really one of race, but there was a police officer in Rome who went into a bank a few years ago on his lunch to go cash his check. And while he was in there, the bank was being robbed at gunpoint. Pulled his gun, turned and was face to face with the gunman pointing his gun at him. And in that moment, chose not to shoot. And the question had been posed to him time and time again, why didn't you shoot? You would have been justified. And to Mark's point, he watched his hands and had judged that he wasn't going to shoot. So sometimes you get people who act even beyond their training and use a level of judgment that you would not expect, because most police officers are trained in that moment. The gun is facing at you. You've got about half a second to make a decision to whether or not to shoot, and he didn't shoot. So I think when we talk about training, we talk about it as though training always works, because we've all worked with people in every walk of life where we're all trained the same way, but it just doesn't take. So we have to have mechanisms in place to remove those people who we know it didn't take. That's really what it comes down to. We have to have those mechanisms. Now, that's a discussion we're going to have in a future webinar and maybe later on today, but that is part of what we haven't talked about today that really gets to the crux of what the big problem is getting to that disciplinary procedure and being able to remove people when you need to.
Thank you so much, Bernie. And on that note, I want to state, so the webinar will continue. The broadcast portion, we're going to turn to Doc Woods, but I want to remind everyone that next week our topic is justice in the process. I want to extend a thank you to all of our panelists, Steve, Bernie, and Mark, but also state after the broadcast, the webinar will continue. And now I will turn it over to Doc.
Wait a minute, can you stop the music? Can someone please make sure I'm being heard? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, because, okay, now, I wanted to say I'm very honored to be on this program, and I'm very honored on each program to talk about the concept of the cry. Because once again, when we're talking about de-escalating, people will make a cry before they go to other levels. So the people who are in situations that could turn negative and escalate and call for interaction by police and perhaps use of force, that person, if they have an outlet, perhaps will make a cry long before that happens. So now if we listen to the rhythm and blues music, the people will make a cry in the music. They will tell you what they need. Now, so we talked about blues and we talked about gospel in the first two issues of the music. In the rhythm and blues, you have just the daily interactions between people. In this case, it's a romantic situation. It's a man-woman romantic situation. And the woman is making her cry, and she's saying to the man, and said, "Oh, baby, now come on back. You know I'm going to treat you right." They said, and you're out there running around looking for something that don't exist. I'm a good woman. Whatever you got, bring it on home to me. And the answer says this. The woman is saying, you know, if I could get even one of my palates satiated, maybe the tension that I have wouldn't go to another level. Now let's listen to Aretha Franklin sing, "Bring It On Home to Me." Okay, we can start the music.
it on home to me. Yeah, they bring it on home to me. Oh, 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 yeah. They bring it on home to me. They can help you, baby. You know you ought to bring it on home to me. Oh, yeah, you ought to bring it on home.
As we part, I just want to say one last thing about Aretha Franklin. I have a photo of me and my wife standing with Aretha Franklin, which I cherish. And it helps me to have heroes. And when I can have heroes that I can look to, it helps me to stay out of trouble. And Aretha Franklin is simply the finest female R&B singer in history, period. Nobody else can even carry her gym bag.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Doc. I think most, if not all, people would agree with you on that point. So thank you very much for that selection and explanation of the lyrics. So, and thank you for staying with us for this really important discussion on the use of force. We still have a lot of questions, so I'm going to get right to them. And the next question actually touches somewhat on the last question we discussed about, training and taking into account racism that exists in society. So, police have to interpret actions of suspect to determine how to respond. How do we deal with implicit bias that can make police officers misinterpret what he or she sees? So a few of you mentioned, watching the hands of the suspect. Some may argue that the police officer may interpret the hand movements differently depending on the color of those hands. So how do you deal with implicit bias in police officer responses?
Well, let me take a stab at it because I'm not sure that that's an easy one to address because, like you said, the bias is implicit. And you can educate people to it, but usually when it's implicit and if they will see themselves explicitly as not biased. So you want to train a certain judgmental set, meaning judgment of the situation, not of the person. And I think, again, if you're watching hands, and I don't want to overstate this, but you can tell if it's somebody yanks a shirt up and reaches for something in their waistband, you can be fairly on high index that that's not good for you, that is potentially a weapon. However, somebody that in a car, in a traffic stop, takes their hands off the wheel and goes to the console could be getting the registration. It could easily be. To interpret that, you have to be very careful. And this is where being observant and being verbal, somebody starts to do that, you say, no, please keep your hands where I can see them. Where's your registration? And they'll say in the console, say very carefully. That's one of the ways you do it. But I think you have to look at it in the sense of your overall behavior. And the police have it doubly hard because you get 1 second to make a decision and the jury gets 2 years to decide if you were correct or not in that analysis. But you're dealing with people's lives, just like Marty said. So, it's a high stakes, it's not, I don't use the word game, meaning lightly, but it's a high stakes profession. It's a high stakes decision you make every time. And I think with a certain set of training and a certain set of skills that people employ regularly, that will improve, I believe. But implicit bias is one of the hardest things in the world to attack, no matter what.
I fully agree with that. I think implicit bias it provides a challenge. One of the reasons I think it provides a challenge in training is because by trying to train away implicit bias, you are actually training in other biases. As complicated as that sounds, we have to think about that because I always think about my own personal experiences when I think about these things and go back to a time when growing up, I had an aunt who said to me, who had accused me of something, and I became vehemently upset and denied. And her retort to me was, by denying so strongly that I had protested too much and therefore I had done it. And actually, anybody who knows me, when you accuse me of doing something I didn't do, I'm going to lash out. So You can't teach that reaction because you can have your beliefs. But the fact of the matter is for me, my integrity is important. So when someone accuses me of acting outside of that, I become a little angered. So, and I react differently than maybe most. I don't know. Or maybe most people will act that way. We don't know. So that's the complication in trying to teach away certain biases, that you end up teaching in other biases, right? So it's an interest. It's very difficult to just teach that away, because one way or the other, as human beings, race or not, we are inherently biased in making our decisions. So yeah, I agree with Mark. It's one of the toughest areas for us to address.
I would like to respond to that by saying this is something that needs to be addressed, and that's the makeup of the police department. It should mirror their community, and they should live in the community. It's just simple as that. Mm-hmm. And in these cases where you have these all-white police force, or nearly all-white police force, policing the inner city, has and our city is one of the most diverse in the United States. And the Utica police force, for instance, has been doing community policing for a while. And I know I've seen walk right by my law office on the Genesee Street. Okay, so you really need to make great strides to recruit. And I think everybody agrees you got to go in early if you're going to talk and want to get minority recruits, so you're not perceived as the enemy, that you're perceived as a beneficial profession that the inner city community and the diverse community wants to join. And it's actually a wonderful profession, and it pays well, and it would be great to recruit in the city from which you're drawing your officers.
Well, that's an excellent point that has come up in a number of conversations about having the department reflect the community, or have the police officers live in the community. And I think that could aid in terms of some of the issues of communication that you all have mentioned. If you live in the community and you also reflect the residents who live there, that would seem to aid your ability to understand, communicate, and de-escalate when necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So, thank you.
Yeah, and just to follow up, an interesting point on the whole concept of bias, though, and this is what I say, as human beings, we have this thing about bias in other ways. For instance, I've been approached in the courtroom, and frankly, because of the color of my skin, most people who approach me assume that I must be for the defense, because that's the only place a black man can be. And so that bias has come from all members of the community in every way, shape, or form. So, yeah, bias is a very, very difficult thing to overcome, and for a variety of reasons.
No, that's an important part as well. And bias will affect everyone who lives within a bias system. Right. So this question, it's slightly different as well. It's a question about police unions. They've been receiving a bit more attention lately. This question from an attendee: how do police unions hinder the way we can hold police officers accountable for improper use of force?
Well, do they, first of all, understand that the police unions are in a way are set up like the court system? We have an adversarial system. And the idea being that each side presents its conflicting information, they hash it out, and the truth. Okay. So try to keep that in mind when you look at what the police unions are doing. Their job is to vehemently defend their people. But also, it's just like being a defense attorney too. You have to consider, you're not going to go in there hopefully and let someone lie intentionally. So they, in my experience, which has not been as much as it is up here, but my experience has been that the unions will attempt to, after a point, police themselves, and that's a good place to be. Once they realize that by policing themselves, they learn that if they do it, then nobody else will do it for them. And that can be kind of a healthy thing for the department. And I think it can help accountability. But otherwise, they're set up in an adversarial situation. They have to provide a vigorous and zealous defense for an officer charge.
Their members are the police officers, and that's who they serve. And the union itself is not beholden to the community, but beholden to its members. And that causes a dichotomy when we look at this, because one of the things, and you've seen it locally, and we're going to see it play out locally again, but the police chief doesn't ultimately have the single say in what happens with a police officer. They make a recommendation, and ultimately the union and the administration will decide that they're going to go to arbitration to arbitrate what the punishment for a police officer should be relative to a particular incident. The problem that's built into that system is that both sides have to agree on who that arbitrator is. And if an arbitrator is known to not side with the union, that arbitrator will not be chosen. If there's an arbitrator who's been known to go down the middle and sort of cut the, come to some agreement somewhere in the middle where the officer keeps his job, but he loses pay for a few months, or loses certain privileges, or loses rank, the union is more apt to agree to that particular arbitrator. So that part of the process, and it's a great question because it gets to the heart of the issue that I've been talking about with regard to discipline. We think discipline is as simple as, we know what the right discipline is here, the police chief recommends it, and it happens. It doesn't happen that way. And oftentimes, because of the way the system is set up in this adversarial setup, that the union provides the best defense they can for their officers, and the officer ends up keeping their job.
Thank you. Steve, did you want to add to that?
Well, police unions are the problem. Okay? And over the years, they've just, gotten more and more power. And basically and the municipalities, politicians come and go. We have different, figures, and no politician wants to have the police against them, put it simply as that. So I think that whole area needs to be reviewed. For example, in New York State, when the legislature and Governor Cuomo repealed 50A, the first thing the unions did, and it wasn't the police departments, it was the unions, was to try to get the legislature to repeal the repeal. I mean, they're just, totally on the side of the police officers. And of course, all unions negotiate for their members. But I think it's been particularly difficult around the country because of the unions.
To follow up on that, so one issue that's been raised with unions, and thinking about issues of defense and how with collective bargaining they're able to negotiate the types of discipline that will be handed down to officers who are found to behave in certain ways. There's been a push for greater transparency, as you just mentioned. Do you all think that would benefit the relationship between police and communities if communities have a better sense of the relationship that police unions have to the actual department? Because I think a lot of the public, that relationship is mysterious and cloudy. So would transparency be beneficial there?
Transparency would be beneficial for people to understand the whole process, because what has happened is a lot of times when the punishment that's meted out is not what the public wants or it finds acceptable, it automatically goes to the administration as the cause. The unions have been insulated from that public persona. They don't you don't talk about the unions. We don't see them as part of the process. In fact, they are the silent conspirator that sits out there that nobody knows about, nobody talks about. So I think that has to be addressed. And I think a couple of the ways we can start addressing this is, one, perhaps unions should have the ability, the membership of unions, because I firmly believe that most police officers don't want the Chauvins of the world as part of their profession. And giving the union membership the ability to vote up or down whether or not to provide this vehement defense for an officer who doesn't deserve it might be a way of having the police force or law enforcement put up or shut up. That's one. And two, the other way is, you know, if we know that part of the cause is the arbitration process, and that's the breakdown, and that the police have an overwhelming duty to protect the community and protect our lives, and that lives are at stake, as part of the reforms that go to the governor, one of those reforms should be to declare such part, the part of union contracts that call for arbitration, to call them out and to say that they're against public policy and therefore void them because they go against public policy and the safety of the community.
Thank you. Mark or Steve, did you want to reply?
I think if we were to do that, you would probably buy about 15 years worth of litigation.
Yeah.
It should be interesting.
Also, I think that there, again, transparency, the public, we the people ought to be able to see those contracts. And maybe they need to be revised and renegotiated.
Yeah, that's definitely been a part of the dialogue as well. So next question is related to something that came up in your response, Bernie. And in thinking about reporting when an officer has perhaps used excessive force. If you were an officer yourself and you've noticed that someone you work with has behaved in an appropriate way, used excessive force, we hear about, you know, the blue wall of silence. And, you know, this reluctance to report on people we work with, it's not just with police, it's kind of everywhere, but we definitely hear about it there. What types of incentives can departments put in place to encourage officers to report when they've noticed that, you know, someone they work with has used excessive force?
There's a couple of different things that have been talked about out there, and I'll touch on both of them. One of them has been, okay, when we talk about certain crimes, you talked about in the workplace. So most workplaces now, if you know, we're talking about preventing crimes within the workplace or preventing any type of fraud in the workplace, we talk about having tip lines, a complaint line where people can call anonymously. So even though they don't want to report someone, they can still do it anonymously and be protected and not have to worry about the ramifications or the retaliation that might come down the road. So that's one area, one thing that some law enforcement agencies are actually doing now, where they allow for another officer to call in anonymously and say, here's what's going on. The issue with that for me is this. As law enforcement officers, aren't we supposed to be standing up to that behavior and holding people accountable? And shouldn't we be holding each other accountable in that case, right? If you're out there enforcing the law against the community or within the community on the basis that people should be accountable for their actions, you in fact have to be accountable. So, or hold your fellow officer accountable. So that's another area. The third thing, which has been talked about on the federal level, is frankly removing the protection for individual officers, you know, when it comes to liability. And if officers, fellow officers or officers that were on the scene, for instance, the other 3 officers that were on the scene at George Floyd's death, if they knew that they were going to possibly be held responsible for this death, would they have stepped in and stopped it if they knew that everything that was happening, they were also on the line and they could be sued individually? Would they have stepped up in that case and said, the blue line goes, you know, sideways, I'm doing what's right here? So some of those other protections and walls we need to break down to really change the culture, that blue line culture that's out there.
Thank you, really good suggestions. Mark or Steve?
Go ahead, Mark.
Those are very good ideas.
I would say too that there's a liability for police officers for their failure to intervene if another officer is using excessive force. And it's actually a cause of action I always include in my federal litigation. And the problem is that officers, when they're trained, and I know this from William Fisher, who is my expert in many cases, they're trained how to respond to a question they don't want to answer. So they don't have to. So, and the response is, to the best of my recollection, I do not recall, or I do not recall, or I can't remember. Okay. Well, that's just in the Bersani case, I think it was 119 times the two officers testified they could not recall. I mean, they even claimed that they'd never discussed the case. It took place 5 years later. It turned out we learned that they were not only part-time Cicero police officers, they were part-time Cicero Park Rangers, and they lived together for 7 years. Okay, so that really needs to be remedied. I don't know exactly how you remedy it.
Perhaps the cultural change that Bernie was mentioning. And kind of keeping within this discussion of incentives and addressing issues of excessive force, one of the panelists posed a question, what are your opinions on a zero tolerance policy for excessive force? So, I guess, if there is an accusation and it seems to be substantiated, then, you are let go. So a zero tolerance policy.
I think that is entirely possible, but zero tolerances in anything are difficult because there are different levels. For instance, if you follow the force continuum and you yell at somebody and that is deemed excessive force, I'm not sure you should lose your job over that. I mean, it depends on, it could be taken to an illogical extreme either way. So problems with that. But if you're in a situation where you have a sustained complaint of excessive physical force, then that is a different ballgame, and that may well work to realize that's a career ender. In the departments that I was privileged to be a member of, that was a career ender for you. I don't care how experienced you were. That would be your career ender.
And I agree with Mark. I think you have to maintain a certain level of proportionality, and the punishment has to fit the crime. So when we're talking about excessive physical force, that would be, obviously that would make sense. From time to time, could someone use excessive verbal force because they misjudge a situation? Should that be a retraining, or should that be a removal? If we start treating those things on the same level, then we're going to water down what we get as law enforcement, because that's going to have a negative effect on whether or not we can have people who are perfectly capable of the job but make a mistake, because again, we have human beings. But of course, the zero tolerance concept comes in when we're talking about mistakes that put people at substantial risk, compared to if I yell at you because I misperceived what you said to me, because if you have kids, we all know that happens, or I misperceived what happened a minute ago. My kids will tell you that's a different situation than if we turn to physical force in that circumstance. So using the force continuum, I think when we get near the latter part of that continuum, absolutely a zero tolerance policy would probably be the best thing for the community.
Thank you.
Yeah, another problem is the agreements between the municipalities and their unions. And most unions and police departments basically indemnify their officers, some even for punitive damages. And so they get most, and I know this is true, there's they get time and a half, they get overtime if they're engaged in any kind of litigation, whether it's criminal or civil. So, I mean, that's a disincentive.
Oh, that's a good point. And so we have about 5 minutes left. So I want to ask a question here that's more forward-looking in terms of reform. So and this was posed by a panelist, the New York legislature has made big changes recently in criminal justice, such as reducing use of cash bail and increasing the rights of defendants to see the evidence against them. What do any of you think Albany may look to next in terms of reform?
I'll jump in. I think what we're going to see with reforms, the honest answer is I don't know for sure, we've been part of, some of us within this group and within the College Community Partnership in doing the surveys and talking to, my role in this has been to talk to law enforcement, do the law enforcement side. We have surveys that have been done in the community that we're putting together some data that we plan to ultimately share with the legislature and with through the local municipalities. And some of the things that have come up have been things that have not been discussed in the public forum, and some of those things we discussed today. For instance, reform with regard to unions. One of the big reforms that I think we may see, and it goes to this idea of how do we diversify the police force and really allow the law enforcement to have some opportunity to diversify the force, is a change in the civil rights law, civil
EPLR.
No, I just drew a blank. The law under which civil employment,
Civil service?
civil service. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Steve. Civil service laws, because the way hiring is done for law enforcement, it's based on a test, it's based on a top 3, and it doesn't always mean that those top 3 are the most qualified candidates that you get. And there are some other rules with regard to how those tests are administered, the cost of the test, how many, if you want to be considered for multiple jurisdictions, how many fees you have to pay. And again, you still have to be in the top 3. There are so many impediments within that system that we really need to look to change. And frankly, a lot of forward-thinking law enforcement professionals have brought that up as one of the issues they've had with regard to hiring. The other issue I think we may see change is some of the employment processes, the disciplinary processes, looking at union contracts and the like. So I think those are some of the brief changes I can think about that may come forward, but there's a whole bunch of other suggestions that have been out there that we're looking at.
Thank you. So in our remaining minutes, Mark or Steve, would you like to address that?
No, thank you.
Oh, I'm good.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This has been an extraordinarily informative discussion, and we enjoyed hearing your feedback and experience to this really important question. And thank you all for tuning in. And a reminder, our discussion next week will be on court processes. So definitely tune in for that. But I want to thank our panelists once again, Professor Bernie Hyman, Attorney Steve Lockwood, and Professor Mark Polkosnik, and Professor Doc Woods. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the
Thank
opportunity.
you for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely.